I would really like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of our land. I'm joining today from the Wiradjuri people. However, I realise that a lot of you are coming from other places across the country, so other nations and peoples across our country, and also conscious that interesting to think about it today, actually, an acknowledgement to country or a welcome to country, as our Indigenous people do, is actually really about trust and bringing people onto their land, which is actually a bit akin to the community trust that we walk the line with in our industry. So it's nice to note that we have this in common, and we'd like to maybe work together and commit to reconciling our future in this space with our agricultural industry. So with that in mind, let's pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and extend that to any Indigenous and First Nations people, Torres Strait Islanders, with us today. So just as a little bit of background, community trust in rural industries is about this particular project in our Levied and emerging industry space is about developing the capacities of our industries to monitor, anticipate and respond to changes to community trust within the space. And we want to test some best practices in that space and really get you guys, enabled to deal with the changes that might happen across the broader sector as well. I might just ask everyone to mute themselves, please, just getting a little bit of echo. So today we're going to go into the findings of the first year. This is a three-year project, and so today we're going to see the first year, which gives us a bit of a baseline of where we're going. It helps identify challenges and opportunities and risks while tracking that baseline over the next 3 years. So the format for today will be that I'm going to just run 3 short survey questions to just see who's in the room, so you can all have a glimpse, but more importantly, Courtney, our presenter from Voconiq, can understand who's in the space. She will then present us with the results. We'll have a run through the dashboard, which will be super insightful and useful for you guys in the future. We'll have some Q&A points throughout her presentation. And at the end, you're welcome to throw any questions into the chat. And then at the end, we'll have a quick closing survey just to capture some pieces of info for the project going forward and also for us in running these formatted webinars. So I'll just share my screen and hopefully Teams will play along this afternoon. If you could all just grab your mobile phones and scan that QR code, that will take you straight into our survey, and hopefully we'll see your responses coming up as you enter your answers here. So the first question is very much, which industry are you coming at us from today? What's your space that you would like to have that awareness and knowledge of community trust? And we'll just get a little bit of an insight into that. So, yep, here they come. That's fabulous. All right, if you can just jump in. Obviously, today's about the animal industry, so we won't have any of the plant columns bumping up a number potentially, although maybe some of the internals will be in that space. So a few responses coming through there. If you want to progress through, the next question is about what segment you are within your industry. So we've got a bit of an idea what sort of role you're filling. Great to see the responses there. And the last question for this point in the webinar, just where you're located. Just do a bit of a map across the country. Good to see. Got a few people from across the space. Queenslanders, New Zealand, we can have a state of origin. Oh, here we go. Victoria and Tassie coming on board as well. Great to see. All right, now that survey will stay open, but the rest of the questions are actually about the contents of the webinar. So you can pop your phones down, give Courtney your full attention, and we'll come back to it at the end. So I'll stop sharing, Courtney, and you can get yourself organised. The Voconiq team have been fabulous project leads in this space. We've seen them working across the broader community trust project in agriculture as a broad sector. But we're really privileged to have them come into our Levied Industries space. So on that note, I'll hand over to you, Courtney.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, look, we're on behalf of Voconiq, we're really excited to be presenting today on our Levied Industries work. So I guess a little bit of background before we get started just on Voconiq and who Voconiq is. And to sum it up in one sentence, we give voice to communities and we help industries listen. So we're a social research company that specifically looks at social license to operate and the relationship between organisations and the communities that they interact with. In the agriculture space, that predominantly looks like large national surveys on things such as community trust and acceptance. And we use acceptance as that proxy for social license to operate. So measuring whether or not, the community is so unhappy with you or so happy with you, and where that relationship is sitting. And trust is more measuring that sort of warm, fuzzy feeling. So the nature of the relationship between organizations and community. What we also do is a bunch of primary research in that space, and we'll run through some of the agriculture specific research we do in the next slide. We also do a lot of extension and training opportunities. So we'll talk a little bit about that in how it pertains to the dashboard for everyone here later on in the presentation as well. As Emma said, there'll be lots of opportunities for me to stop and answer any questions, but you're also more than welcome to pop them in the chat, and I'll try and get to them when I can. And if I can't answer all the questions in this session, we'll certainly do a recap at the end. So you'll get your answer eventually. Really welcome any questions, no matter how big or small. So I guess if you zoom out and have a look at our overall portfolio of work that AgriFutures is working with us, there's kind of three different areas or three different projects. The first is the community trust in rural industries, and some of you might be familiar with that. That's our national community sentiment survey on the agriculture industry as a whole. We've been running that for 6 years, and as Emma mentioned, it's launching on Wednesday, our 2024 report, so really look forward to getting everyone's eyes on that. The next one is the Community Perceptions and Worker Experience Project. So we stepped outside of measuring just trust and acceptance, and we looked at the workforce, the agricultural workforce, and really measured attraction and retention to the agricultural industry. And that work's ongoing, and we'll see how attraction and retention changes over time. And then our third piece of work is this one. So it kicked off this year. It's the Community Trust in Levied Industries survey. So similar to the others, it's a national sentiment survey. Community is represented across Australia, large samples, and it's a multi-year project. And why we use this approach is effectively so we can measure three things at once. First, we're measuring the quantitative, so we're putting numbers to the way people think and feel. Second, we're measuring qualitative, so we're capturing people's insights and thoughts through open text comment boxes and also through interviews sometimes. And then finally, we hit on the long-term data. So we're looking at these pieces of data over time to identify really trends in what the community is thinking and feeling, and to help us identify risks in regards to our relationship with those communities over the long term. That will help us as an industry to really set our strategy and move forward together to allow us to build that relationship with the community long term, ensuring that our products and commodities are protected into the future. And that helps us understand the why the relationship is the way it is, and the how to improve that relationship. And so just to orient us in terms of CTRI, which is the larger national survey, I just wanted to give you some headlines from that project, because it really sets the scene in terms of how we informed this particular stream of research and what we kind of already know. So a little bit of a sneak headline from our CTRI findings. The first is that over time, so over the last 6 years, we've seen trust in rural industries remain stable, and we've seen acceptance gradually increase, which is really good news. So despite the fact that the relationship or the mechanics of the relationship hasn't significantly changed, what we've seen is the community broadly becoming more into terms with the fact that agriculture is here to stay, and they value agriculture as an industry. The next piece, and probably a surprise to nobody, is that environment is a key concern for the Australian community, and that concern is becoming increasingly significant. And that plays through into your survey this year as well, and it's important for all of us to consider. Interesting though, in the Levied work, the community was almost more focused on sustainability features than environment in general. So we'll talk a little bit about that and how that's a positive for Levied groups. The next one, and again, this comes through in Levied work as well, but interestingly, has its own unique spin because of the knowledge of your specific industries. Rural identity and connectedness, really, really important when understanding community perceptions. We're going to dive into the dashboard a little bit later to really have a look and unpack how some of those different types of community members think differently about us. And if you think about the comms team, for example, at AgriFutures, that really helps them inform their thinking about how to reach out to those different segments, not only at risk, but others, you know, the people that are really happy with us. How do we continue to engage them to improve that relationship moving forward? Next, we're measuring trust in retailers. So after COVID, interestingly, trust in everyone sort of went sky high, and then trust in rural industries returned back to our baseline. That was not the case for supermarkets. So we've been watching that closely to really understand what it is that people are seeing as trustworthy about retailers. But this year it's kind of dropped back to what its baseline was. So given the context and the inquiries, probably not surprising to this public audience, but it's interesting nonetheless. And then finally, the number of people you know in agriculture definitely impacts your perceptions, but only in certain areas. So we'll have a look again at the dashboard and see how those perceptions might change based on the number of people you know. And sometimes we need to take real stock in that because it's an indicator that we're sitting in an echo chamber. And so one really important piece of this work is that we need to make sure that we're separating ourselves from the room that we're in right now and take a broader look at the audience around us, because you only know what you don't know, and we actually don't know what the person over the road is thinking. Okay, so this is what the work here is helping us do. So on to our community trust in Levied Industries piece. So as Emma said, this is a first in a 3-year program of work. This year is looking at core baselines. So we took some feedback from the Levied group, and we also took our learnings from the community trust work, and we created a survey instrument that we hoped would help capture a baseline for measuring trust and acceptance in Levied Industries over the next 3 years. The next piece of this survey is really about extension and training and capacity development for our Levied groups. So we've got things like the dashboard that are a real tool that can be taken up by people in the Levied groups and used for strategic development. So we'll be running training next year and also additional workshops that will allow you to use this data to improve your industry's strategic plan. So it's a really exciting program of work. We touched on pretty much we did questions for every Levied industry, and we also touched on questions for some of the emerging industries as well. And as we move into 2025, we're starting to look for feedback on this survey instrument, as well as discussions around what key themes are really, really important to you. So at the end of this session, we'll also have some questions relating to that, and always open for feedback on whether or not you think those questions are really hitting home and relevant to your specific group. Now, just quickly before I stop for any questions, demographics. So this slide just basically says we've gotten a sample of 3,300 people. We've gone and done a lot of data cleaning, data checking, and so now we've got a nationally representative survey of just under 3,000 participants of the Australian community. Over the next 2 years, we'll get another 6,000 responses, so a really robust sample. We went for quotas that were representative of state, age, and gender. So all of this data has a healthy spread of the Australian community as per the Australian census data. So you'll be able to split all of our questions, and I'll show you what split means in a minute, by any of the demographics on this particular slide. So it really enables you to dig deep into specific groups, and you can go by age and education. So you can actually bundle some of those groups together to see what specific types of people are thinking. Okay, I'll just pause briefly to see if anyone has any questions, concerns, comments before we move to what our trust scores look like and have a look at our model for social license to operate for Levied Industries.
There's nothing in the chat yet, Courtney, so I think you're right to go.
Let's keep going. I'm a school teacher, so I'm kind of used to either all or nothing here. So, you know, I'm not sure what kind of class I prefer. Okay, so into our headline trust and acceptance scores. This is taken straight from our data dashboard, which we will go into shortly, but I just really wanted to talk to you about these scores first. So as I said, we measure two core things that really quantify the relationship between the community and Levied Industries. The first is trust. So that's kind of the nature of the relationship and how strong it is. And then the second is acceptance, which we use as our proxy for social license to operate. So this year in 2024, we found that your trust score was 3.34 out of 5. So everything you'll see in Voconiq is measured out of 5. Trust is measured from 1, which is not at all, to 5, extremely. So anything over 3 means that more of the community trusts you than doesn't trust you. 3.34, considering the knowledge, and I'll go into knowledge in a minute, considering the knowledge of Levied Industries was quite low, 3.34 is a very robust trust score. It is quite sound and a good springboard for us to work with you on improving over the subsequent years. To put it into perspective, CTRI, and again, this is hot off the press, trust for CTRI or rural industries overall was 3.38. So a little bit of a difference, but nothing to be too concerned about this year. In good news, your acceptance this year, or your social license to operate as measured by the community, was 3.9. And again, anything over 3, really good news. And if you look at acceptance for levied industries versus acceptance for rural industries as a whole, levied was actually higher, with rural industries as a whole being 3.86. If you step back another level, we work with a lot of industries such as mining, transmission, infrastructure as examples. Agriculture generally sits on the higher end of both trust and acceptance. So these scores above 3 are pretty typical for agriculture industry in Australia, but also good to see that you're sitting above that mid score of 3. Next, what we do is an analysis piece where we break down all of the questions from our survey. So we've got a survey that takes participants about 15 minutes to complete, and we do analysis on those questions to see which of the questions cluster and which ones best pull the levers or drive trust and acceptance. So this model, it's from our report. You'll see a slightly different one in the dashboard, but we'll just break it down together right now. So procedural fairness was one of your top drivers of trust, as was chemical use, innovation, and regulation. Now, what you'll see here are arrows that are leading to either trust or acceptance, or both in some cases. Those arrows either represent a positive or a negative relationship. So we can see blue lines mean positive, red lines mean negative. Then you'll see numbers on these lines. Now, I don't want you to hold stock too much on what these numbers are. They don't add to 100. These are basically coefficient ratings here. And so what we're actually looking for is the size of the number relative to the other numbers on this model. So we can see here that rural industries are innovative, has the highest score related to trust. So that's our number one driver of trust this year, innovation. That score will be more than double the strength of support for the use of chemicals. And we'll go into what these actually mean in a minute. So what we've got here are weightings that allow you to understand what is doing the most work in relation to trust or acceptance, into driving trust or acceptance. As an industry, or a group of industries in this case, that allows us to sit back and think, what is going to have the largest impact on trust if we change it, or if we use a strategy to try and change it? Conversely, that also helps us understand where our risks are. So in relation to increased regulation is necessary, this one means basically the more that the Australian community thinks that the agriculture and levied industries needs more regulation, the less they trust you. And so if something goes wrong, that means that the community then still is critical of regulation, or is more critical of regulation. And so we can think of things like national inquiries into particular supermarkets, for example. That will mean that your trust score is more likely to go down. So that's your risk indicator there. So what we're going to do now is go through specific areas of interest in this model. And then what we'll do is work through each individual animal levied group and see what your trust and acceptance drivers were. So first, let's take a look at responsibility. So as you can see on the model, so I'll go back to the model. As you can see on the model, this doesn't feature, but what does feature is procedural fairness, which is closely related to industry responsibility. Responsibility was also a very key driver for trust for most of the animal levied industries. So when I look at this driver, I pulled out the key questions that related to this particular driver. And you'll see this graph a few times in the next 5 minutes. So I just want to unpack it before we get into the questions. So from left to right, you'll see colors orange, blue, and gray. The orange colors represents responses of disagree or strongly disagree. So if we pull that 5-point scale up, Voconiq's 5-point scale, that's people scoring 1 or 2 to an answer to a question. Then we've got light and dark blue. Those answers are 4 and 5, or agree and strongly agree. What we then do is pull grey off, which is neutral, and pop it to the side. That allows us to compare directly people that have polarized views on a particular question and to also analyze the neutrals separately. When we look at a score of 3 on a 5-point scale, it basically means somebody didn't know, didn't care, or didn't have enough information to answer the question appropriately. And some of our data cleaning actually helps clarify what's going on there. But we always say that the neutrals are really important. What I've done is highlight this particular box here in the middle, the 39%, because that's a slightly higher than average neutral score. If you've got somebody that's really, really strong on opinion, so strongly disagreeing or strongly agreeing, their opinion is really difficult to change. But if you've got somebody sitting on the fence, they're a lot easier to go and have a conversation with, put out some media, show them what the industry is doing directly, or give them a product that they really associate with, and that will change their mind. So that's where the opportunity sits for Australian rural industries and levied industries, in that neutral space. But it's also where our risk sits. So when that percentage, the neutral percentage, starts edging over 39% towards the 40s, that's where we've got a real opportunity, but also where people that are potentially having polarized views to our industry or other agendas are able to sway that group. So we really need to focus in on what's happening in that neutral space. And I'm pointing here because my screen's here. Sorry, it makes sense when you're in the room. Okay, so we've got 3 questions here related to responsibility for levied industries. So the first is, generally, I feel that Australian producers in rural industries treat animals raised for slaughter with dignity and respect throughout their lives. I thought it was pertinent to include this question because we're speaking to animal industries. Now, what you can see here is that the majority, so 55% of the Australian community, said that what your industries are doing is in line with their expectations for animal dignity and respect. So you've got a lot of the Australian community on side in terms of how these animals are treated and how they are treated then towards the end of life. The next piece, Australian producers, breeders and growers manage their environmental impacts effectively. And again, you've got a pretty high percentage. So you've got over half of the Australian community agreeing that what levied industries is doing is good for the environment. But you're starting to have that increased neutral percentage here. And as I said earlier, environment is a key concern for pretty much everyone and across all of our surveys. So this is one to watch, especially when people aren't really sure what is going on and what that means particularly. And then finally, water use. Australian rural industries use water responsibly. Again, over half of the Australian community is agreeing with that. You've probably got slightly more disagrees than you would normally, but again, we've probably got too much of a neutral here and we do have space to improve on that. Okay, so let's move over to procedural fairness. Again, a key driver for trust and acceptance for levied industries and a pretty much number 1 or 2 driver across every industry as we move forward. So procedural fairness is the ability to listen and respond to community opinions or thoughts. So that's basically, is the community giving feedback? Do we have channels for them to give feedback? And when they are we showing that we're making action? And action isn't always changing all of our practices to accommodate for people that are complaining. It's listening actively and then saying, I've heard you, this is what we will do, and coming to a conclusion that makes the community feel involved in a negotiation. So what I've done is included the CTRI scores for both of these questions, and we'll just quickly unpack them. So the first question, rural industries in Australia are prepared to change their practices in response to community concerns. This question is asked in both CTRI and in the Levied Community Trust work. So your mean score, so remember these are scored out of 5, your mean score was 3.39. Again, that means that more of the community agreed than disagreed with the question, that you are changing your practices when the community says so. One thing I wanted to flag was that was below the industry average. The next one, rural industries in Australia listen and respect community opinions. And again, healthy mean, above 3.5 is very good for this question, and actually slightly higher than the CTRI results for 2024. We see a pretty high neutral percentage in the first question. So again, space to improve in that particular area, but not too many in that strongly disagree space. I might just pause for a minute and just address Jeremy. I may have missed it, but were community surveyed just on AgriFutures Industries? If not, was the water question skewed due to dairy? So Jeremy, the questions were posed to say farmers, fishers and foresters in one of the surveys, and then producers. We were looking at sort of agnostic rural industries when we're asking the question. It is unlikely it was skewed just because we randomized the question order as well, but it's a great question and always a big concern for everyone that are involved in these surveys. Let's quickly look at chemical use, but only because I want to make a point and I want to make sure we get into the dashboard. So as usual, the Australian community is concerned about our use of chemicals as an industry. We'll touch more on this tomorrow in our plants presentation simply because it's more pertinent, but the one I did want to point out is that I support the use of antibiotics in animals if it keeps animals healthy. Again, huge percentage of agree here. So you've got over 50% of the community agreeing with this and a fairly healthy neutral response. So that means that in terms of operation and use of antibiotics, the industry is in a relatively safe position. The other thing I wanted to point out is that in the majority of these questions, the male and female perception of the answer was different. So when we have a look at the dashboard, we can have a look at maybe who is saying what and why people have these different perceptions of chemical use, in particular in antibiotics. Next, regulation. This is probably where our neutrals are coming into play the most, and often it's where we as an industry have the biggest problem, because we don't control the way that the regulators work with us. We don't control the Australian government putting mandates about our industries. And we don't control how, for example, pesticides and herbicides are mandated and controlled within the country. So it's very difficult for us as an industry to look at regulation and feel empowered and feel like we have a say in this piece. But it's really important for us to consider the way that the community thinks of us and how we act under this set of rules and guidelines. So the three questions I wanted to talk about, I'll just read them out to you first, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion. So the first is penalties for misusing natural resources in rural industries are not strong enough. The second is, I don't think that regulation of Australian rural industries is effective. And the third is Australian rural industries use more water than they are entitled to. Now, the reason that this is important is, again, because of the neutral space. So we've got all of those answers responding more than 40% neutral. So that means the community is presented with those questions. And remember, this ends up being a driver of trust for us. The community answers a lot of those questions with, I don't know. So when something goes wrong in the industry, and let's use, Jeremy, your example of a news article being released about the Australian dairy industry and potentially its impact on water, then what happens is the community that is sitting in that neutral zone, they will start to disagree or strongly disagree with these questions. And that puts our industries at risk, and that puts our trust scores at risk. That undermines our relationship, our long-held relationship with the Australian community. So it's really important that we understand these as a baseline measure and we start tracking them.
That's really interesting.
Just get everyone to mute themselves if they could, please. Just getting a bit of feedback. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. And so it's really important that we're tracking these over time. And this, again, is our baseline measure. So we have the ability to now grab this and experiment with it a little bit to see what can change the community's perception around our activities regarding regulation or our responses to regulators. One really simple thing for us to do is to ensure we're playing the umpire and not playing the ball and not playing the umpire. So a lot of the time, what we do, and as a teacher, I'll use an example from my own working life. We go, oh, the assessments, I'm overloaded because admin is pushing this down on me. And I simply couldn't get all of this done. And it's because admin is telling me what to do. And so I could easily change my language regarding school administration. I could easily say, hey, we've got this awesome Australian curriculum and it's chock full of interesting stuff. And all I have to do is make sure that what I'm teaching is in line with that. And then I'm teaching the right thing and I'm a really great teacher. So instead of kicking the person that's making the regulation, maybe as an industry, we can change our language and our mindset around that piece. And that allows the Australian community to feel connected with what we're doing. Just ending it on a really nice, happy note before we jump into our individual industry drivers. And that's to say, everyone here is valued, and not only valued a little bit, you're valued a lot. And so one of your main drivers for acceptance, so remember that social license to operate, was the importance of rural industries, in particular, obviously, that levied industries context. So we asked a battery of questions. So that's 6 questions related to importance. And as you can see, what's missing here is pretty much orange. So who thinks that rural industries is unimportant? Pretty much no one. So those scores are really positive. It means that the Australian community is on your side. It means that people are listening and watching, and they're giving you benefit of the doubt, right? So if Levied tries something, if you try something as an industry and you fail, these people, the Australian community, are on your side. They accept that you're part of the Australian economy. They accept that you're doing what you can to keep the Australian way of life going. They accept that you provide important products for them and their family that are of value. All of these are really strong positive messages and positive indicators that the relationship is good. And as you can see here, the other indicator is that there's barely any neutrals. So people have strongly positive relationships with Levied Industries, and that's excellent news. Excellent news. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just go through the drivers of trust by each individual animal industry in the Levied group. I will just quickly pause to see if there's any questions, otherwise we'll move on. No, great. Okay, so just as a primer, the top 3 drivers of trust in most industries were the responsibility piece, the support for use of chemicals piece, and that procedural fairness piece, which remember is listening and responding. What I've done is I've included those in the list, but I've put a little asterisk next to them and I've put them in italics. So you can see where your industry differs. What we did was we grabbed each individual industry. We've got an individual industry trust score and an individual industry knowledge score. Now that knowledge is not, we did a test and we found that you knew whatever about horses. That knowledge is self-rated knowledge. So that's kind of different to an exam, right? But it's really important because as you can see, those trust scores and those knowledge scores throughout each industry kind of differ and they work together. So often if there's a really small niche industry that the Australian community didn't really know about, that's directly impacting whether or not they trust you. And so it's very difficult for you as a minor levied industry to feel empowered, like you can contribute to the overall industry's trust, but it does allow you to think about things that you can do that will connect with other industries. And so you might not have that, awareness that some other industries have, but you can work together on the key things that drive trust and acceptance, and that will have relative gains for your industry as well. So just remember that. So we analysed by the trust and knowledge scores, and then we identified what key factors were most predictive for your own industry's trust. And we're just going to go through them quite briefly now. So the first was thoroughbred horses. Trust, see, we can start ticking underneath 3 here. So trust is at 2.78 for thoroughbred horse industry. We've conducted some international research into horse racing and horse welfare, and that's quite consistent with the international point of view of horses in general and horse use. And I would posit that it's related to the welfare piece and what the Australian community is seeing in regards to horse welfare. You can also see that knowledge is under 3. So the Australian community doesn't know a lot about thoroughbred horses and thoroughbred horse breeding specifically. What you can also see is that we've got some pretty consistent drivers of trust. So driver number 3, 4, 5, and 6 were pretty common. But driver number 1 and 2 were actually horse-specific questions. So the largest predictor of trust for the thoroughbred industry is whether or not it's perfectly acceptable for horses to be bred for sport. And I included the mean there. So people were answering 3, right in the middle. So we're on the precipice of maybe getting more widespread acceptance for the industry, but we just need to pull it over. The second is Australian thoroughbred horses significantly contribute to sport and recreation in Australia. And as you can see, the mean is above 3 here. So the community agrees with this. And so that's a really good point of conversation to work with the communities on. People believe that. We might just put Linda's question towards the end of this and dive into it before the dashboard. The last one is quite an interesting one to have come in as a driver, but I'm positing it's because of the welfare links between horses and bees, which is the sentence I thought I'd never say. But the last driver of trust was actually, it's unrealistic to expect beekeepers to care about bee welfare. So there's a relationship between our levied industries, and what bees are doing is surprisingly impacting thoroughbred horses. So that's why it's really important that we work together on these strategies, and it's why it's really important that AgriFutures has created this project, right? Because what we're doing impacts other industries. And the data here is really clear on that. The next one, chicken meat. Trust, again, just a tick under 3. And if you think about the way or the discourse between the Australian community and chicken meat, it does make sense. Knowledge, though, quite high. So the Australian community is rating their knowledge as 3.56. That's fairly high for a self-rated scale. And that's good to know. And it's probably related to the fact that pretty much everyone and their mum eats chicken. So people have a real connection with that product and they're watching it closely, right? So that's good news. The next piece of good news, again, those sort of 4 consistent drivers of trust. And I did throw regulation in there because I thought it was important to pull it out. They're in for chicken meat as well. Interestingly, driver number 2 is, I think it's perfectly acceptable for chickens to be intensively farmed to provide food products. So that was a question we included. Again, the mean was 3. So you've got all of the Australian community sort of sitting on the fence and grappling with these concepts of, do I want affordable food that I can, go to the Coles or Woolies and buy chicken, but then I have to sit with my ethics on whether I want it to be free range and, have this beautiful environment in which I want my chickens to be raised. So the community is grappling with these bigger issues, and you can see it come out in the data. So it's quite interesting. The next one, and this is kind of the first piece that we see that sustainability coming through, really shining through actually, is producers, breeders and growers in Australia are committed to working in a sustainable way. Interesting because they're they're actually linking the chicken industry here with sustainability, which is quite in line with all of the messaging that's come out in regards to poultry. And that's really positive. Interestingly as well, there were other questions regarding poultry that weren't sort of clustered around trust for chicken meat. So there was one about that dignity and respect piece. So that dignity and respect question didn't come through for trust for chicken meat, and nor did chickens being slaughtered for humane purposes. And just as a bit of a spoiler on that one, we did ask a question that was, I don't have a problem with chickens being slaughtered as long as it's humane. And the mean response was 3.8. So most people they've come to terms with the fact that to eat meat, you have to kill it. And often we use language like slaughter to invoke a response and to see whether or not the community has that really visceral response to it. So it's good to see that the Australian community has come to terms with this fact, and they're happy to have the conversation about it. So for our next industry, we've got deer. So again, this is one that people didn't really know about, and I think in the comments for our survey, we actually had one that said, I didn't know we farmed deer. So really interesting to see this one again. The trust is slightly a tick below 3, and knowledge is quite low here. Again, we see the top 4 drivers of trust are actually the top 4 drivers of trust for deer as well. And then the other pieces that have come up that impact trust specifically for deer are whether or not horses are being bred for sport. Thanks, Felicity. Whether producers, breeders, and growers are working in a sustainable way. So again, we're seeing that link between Levied Industries and sustainability, which is really clear. And then that other piece on slaughter and whether or not it's humane. So because deer isn't a well-known industry, other themes are sort of clustering towards its trust. So again, we are all interconnected, and what we do impacts others. There were questions that were specifically calling out deer, and they didn't play into this trust scoring. So it's interesting to see how the community are looking at these different products. Next, goats. Perfect. Trust is 3. So we're kind of on the fence for this one as well, and knowledge is incredibly low. I think what's starting to show here is that despite goats being an animal product, people associate fiber as something that you don't kill. So we've been through a lot of animals, we'll exclude thoroughbreds out of this obviously, but we've been through a lot of animals that have been farmed for consumption, and now we're starting to move towards the animals that are farmed for fiber, and the community has a bit of a different relationship with that particular type of product. Again, top 4 drivers of trust are the top 4 drivers of trust in our model. And then we see some things like animals raised for non-food products like goat fiber rarely face animal welfare issues. Interestingly, the mean here is 3 again. So community is not really sure what's going on with goats. Considering the knowledge score of 1.75, it's actually not that surprising. I would posit that the majority of the respondents here answered in that grey neutral space. Great opportunity for the Australian goat industry, or goat fibre industry, sorry, to really engage with groups to show what you're doing to enhance animal welfare and how you're working with regulators to ensure that you're compliant with the animal welfare standards. The next one is Australia receives a fair share of benefits from rural industries in Australia. I think that's a typo, but that should include levied in that specific question. But basically what people are thinking when they're looking at whether or not, or assessing whether or not they trust goats is whether the Australian economy benefits from the farming and use of goats as a fibre product. And because they're not really aware of what's going on in goat farming, because their knowledge is 1.75 out of 5, perhaps they need to really sort of understand that or get some education regarding what's going on. And the last piece, and this is just a standard animal welfare question, which is why it's driving trust in goats, is whether or not people are capable of skinning and butchering animals for meat. Next up is kangaroos. So kangaroos, because they're the Australian icon, right? A lot more people know about kangaroos, but I think when you're looking at the farming practices behind kangaroos, the knowledge has dropped a little bit, but trust and knowledge both over that 3, that's good news. Again, we see our 4 drivers of trust feature throughout the questions. And importantly, we've got specific questions related to kangaroos showing up in the assessment of whether or not we trust this industry. So the first is, we should eat more low carbon meats like kangaroo. And excitingly, it's over the mean. So people are associating this with the positive sustainability elements of eating kangaroos and consuming kangaroo meat. The second kangaroo related question is actually one that we chucked in to be a little bit sneaky. Thanks, Ellen. It is great news. Chucked in to be a little bit sneaky. So it's necessary to slaughter animals like kangaroo as a form of population control. And again, this is us trying to understand where the community lies in terms of understanding slaughtering and understanding that these animals are consumed for meat and whether or not it's a real risk to us as an industry. And as we can see, the mean is 3.6, which means that the majority of the community are okay with the fact that that's happening and they understand the purpose of that, which is great news. Second to last, buffalo. So trust of 3.1, knowledge of 1.92. This is another industry where we got a few comments going, what is this? And didn't know that we had this product in Australia. So again, interesting to understand where we fit in the spectrum of knowledge as Levied Industries. We've got our 4 key drivers of trust, again featuring in this particular animal group, but then we also have that sustainability driver coming through. So people are linking buffaloes with sustainability. They're also thinking about the use of horses for sport. So that's a theme that's coming up again and again. I think, again, it's because of the use of the welfare and a lack of understanding of what buffalo actually are. So that's kind of linking those 2 together. And then finally, a buffalo specific question. Australia should stop the export of live buffalo to overseas markets, regardless of the impact of Australian producers. Now, we often ask trade-off questions. So the Australian community is sitting there thinking, okay, I could have been asked a yes, no about whether or not we should stop the export, but what I'm now being asked is to consider the implications and to bring the human element into it. And that gives us a really interesting understanding of where the Australian community's priorities lie. And so an answer of 3.1, again, it's just over the midpoint. It means that slightly more of the Australian community are agreeing that you should stop the live export of buffalo to overseas markets, regardless of the impact on Australian producers. But when we looked into that scale, the majority was sitting in the neutral. They didn't actually have an opinion. So it's more of a stats game on who's on the extreme ends. And finally, the good news for honeybees and pollination, the most trusted group. So their trust was 3.61 and knowledge was 3.16. One of the more well-known groups of the Levied, I think people really understood that honeybees play a really important role in both sustainability and the environment and the food chain. So there was comments regarding that. And yes, everybody does love honeybees. And there were lots of comments about how much people loved bees in the survey as well, which was really nice to see. What you can see here is that we've actually only got 3 of our drivers of trust. So responsibility, procedural fairness, and regulation in here, which is, I think, an important finding because people aren't bringing that chemical piece into bees. But what is happening is you can see the importance to Australia as the 2nd largest driver of trust for honeybees. So again, like I said, people can see the role of bees in Australia and they understand the core role of honeybees as pollinators to a lot of our food. Next, we're looking at sustainability. So that sustainability piece is coming through. And also food produced in Australia adheres to strict food safety standards. So I think that might be popping off into other areas or recent news on honeybees here because we surveyed at the start of the year. And then finally, standards developed for rural industries in Australia ensure people do the right thing. So again, that piece of, hey, there was some news about honeybees towards the start of the year, perhaps the community is responding to that. But it hasn't really impacted the fact that it is the most trusted of our groups today. So just to recap everything I've blabbed about for the last hour or so far, we've got a solid baseline for trust and acceptance. Your trust and acceptance is really strong, right? So we've got room to move, but we've also got a really solid baseline where we feel like we've got agency and benefit of the doubt. So if we wanted to experiment as a group of industries or as individual industries, we do have the space. The next piece is that we've got critical trust drivers that we should all be considering and working together on. Those are responsibility, so welfare predominantly, and sustainability come under that, procedural fairness and regulation. So these are the things that are most shaping communities' trust in us. The next piece is that we're really valued. So 81% of Australians said that they prefer Australian-made products. 82% said they trust Product of Australia labelling. And if you think back to that value slide, pretty much everyone in the Australian community sees value in Levied Industries. Something that we'll talk about is demographic differences. So the dashboard that we're diving into really reveals some key demographic differences that are important for us to consider. And the last two are, environment, sustainability, and animal welfare are really important for us all to consider. And even the plant industry group tomorrow, I'll say, you need to be watching animal welfare issues, because animal welfare issue in one group will impact everybody. So it's important that we work together on these themes and we keep an eye out on what's going on across the horizon for our rural industries. I will just pause for any questions, but I know that we had an observation from Linda, so I'll just read that out. It's clear that traceability is key to this, but do communities understand what it actually means and how and why it gives trust and assurance? That is a really good question. I think when we talk about traceability, we're talking about a couple of different things, right? And so we measure a couple of different things in these surveys. The first is the connection to the person that's actually producing the product. The second is actually the trust in the product's journey. And then finally is the trust in labeling. And so when we break it down into sort of those discrete phases, we can see that the community differs depending on the product. We can have a look at those answers specifically, Linda, because I don't have them off the top of my head in the dashboard, and see actually what's happening on that journey. I think the other piece we need to consider is that the Australian community is actually smarter and more switched on than we often give them credit for. And so when we're talking about the community, we should actually be engaging and talking to them. We as an industry often think, oh, that's too complicated. Oh, the community won't know. The community's watching. The community wants to have a conversation about a lot of these areas of interest. You can see that in their responses to things like whether or not they're comfortable seeing an animal slaughtered to consume. They understand the nuance of working in agriculture and they want to be engaged with it. So I think that's something that we can really unpack in terms of traceability as well, because I think they will really understand the process of traceability and they would really be open to having a conversation about it. Does anyone else have any questions before we move into the data dashboard? Great. I'll just move this over. Thanks, Linda. Can you let me know if you can see a new screen now? Just a nod. Perfect.
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you. All right. So this dashboard is available to AgriFutures, and the LEI team will have the login details. We will be providing additional training to the LEI team and anyone that they identify needs additional use of this dashboard. What we're going to do now is basically go through some of the key features of this dashboard, but I want you to understand. Jeremy, I'll get back to you at the end, sorry. I just want you to understand that you will be trained in this, and this is just a quick whip through to show you the capabilities and some of the key findings in this data dashboard. The other piece is that AgriFutures actually has a dashboard that shows all of the community trusts, so the 6 years of work plus this levied piece of work. So they're able to sort of compare and contrast from rural industries in general to levied industries specifically. So that's something I think is really important to know. Okay, so dashboard, you log in, you get your details from the LEI team, or the LEI team goes and does this for you. And or they shoot a request off to me, probably more specifically. So you log in. On the left, you've got your menu, and then in the middle here, you've got whatever we're looking at the time. So you can see here we're on our homepage, and that's got our trust and acceptance scores in the middle. What we've got here is also trust and acceptance in context. So we've got all of our different groups where we've measured trust and acceptance for this particular survey. So you can see here, honey beekeepers sitting at the top, good on them. You can see Levied overall. And actually, because of honeybees having this beautiful halo and everybody loves them, it's pulling trust in all Levied industries up. So good job, honeybees. Keep up the good work. You can also sort of see where your specific group sits compared to other groups. And we've measured a few different types of external groups as well, including government and supermarkets. The next piece is the model. So you're able to pull up the model and actually interrogate any of the particular drivers of trust that we've talked about today. So let's say you're interested in seeing what I've already presented. Let's go to the importance one because I think it's really lovely. This is our driver of acceptance. Rural industries are important to Australia. And as you can see, our sea of blue back again, you can hover over these to see exactly what the percentages are because some of them are a bit difficult. And you can also see the number of respondents that selected that particular answer, which is really good. You can also, if you're somebody that loves these pictures, you can download it. So you just press that download plot as an SVG and it will download it as an image file on your desktop. So if you were to present back to your industry group and you wanted a couple of nice pictures, you could actually just download them directly and put them in a PowerPoint. Down here is actually how much they correlate to both trust and acceptance. So if this went up, trust would go up and acceptance would go up by that much. Next is just sort of the ins and outs and the hardcore questions of this particular survey. So the first is our demographics. So I said you could use any of the demographics as a split for any of our other data. So you could actually go in and have a look at, oh, okay, what were the demographics measured and how many people were measured from each. Because this is related to the CTRI dashboard, there may be some blank areas because we tried to keep the levied one a little bit more lean. But you can also see, you know, we ask things like dietary restrictions. So you might be interested in, for instance, somebody that's got gluten intolerance and how they're responding to certain questions. People they know and regions. So you can flick through that. But I think the main point of it is that you can then go into our question themes. So we've blocked all of our questions by specific themes in these ones here with the little compass. And so you can click on any of those. This will show you that same 5-point scale, but we've aggregated the blue in a lot of them. The grey in a lot of them. So they look like a sliding scale. And this is our trust in specific rural industries. That's where I got that score from earlier. But what you can then do is split this data. So you might be interested in trust in rural industries, and let's just grab the mean while I'm here. So the mean is 3.34. You might want to know what the trust is for people who are 18 to 34 in rural industries. And so that will then filter that information for you. So 3.23, slightly lower. You might want to add an additional filter. So you might want to be like, okay, I want to understand people in that group who live in the city. And so that went from 3.34 down to 3.19. So that group would potentially be an at-risk group. And then you could also compare the percentage of neutral that come from that data split. One thing that I would note is that if you go a little bit too crazy with filters, the information may stop showing up. Because of research ethics, we want to make sure our participants are protected. So anything with lower than sort of 40 responses, often our dashboard will block you seeing it. But certainly if you do have a question that the dashboard is not able to answer, you're more than welcome to reach out to the Voconiq team. I'll just reset these filters. Because we've gone through the vast majority of these questions, I'm just going to show you a couple of interesting other features that might help us understand these demographics pieces that I've been alluding to over the course of this presentation. So this is our group means function. I'm not going to show you the over time functions because obviously we've only got one data set, but next year I'll be presenting our over time information as well. So this little widget allows us to have a look at any question we want and explore by any of the demographics. So let's say we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into, let's go, the regulation question. So this question came up a few times. I don't think that regulation of Australian rural industries is effective. You can split it by anything. Generally, we were seeing, and here I'm lying, generally we were seeing gender differences, not in this one, but you can split it also by age group. So you can see here, people that are younger are a little bit more cynical of the regulation. But really you can pick anything and go into detail. So often we're, as an industry, concerned about metro versus rural or city versus country. The error bars here, which are these little lines at the top, they are overlapping, which means that difference is not significant. So it doesn't matter if you're metro or rural, you have an equal amount of cynicism around regulation of Australian rural industries. Interesting. If you are just here for a quick whip through and you want to find your specific group, you can just go Control F and write in the word like I just have here, and it will highlight every time your specific word features. So I've used bees because we've been talking about them and they're in my head. So pollination from honeybees is essential to produce certain foods in Australia. This is split by metro and non-metro, and again, not really a significant difference. Everyone's pretty in agreement that honeybees are important. If you split by age group, interestingly, older people think honeybees are way more important than younger people, and that's a significant difference. So you could go through these questions with any research question in your head or any assumption, and you can test that assumption. So if you're thinking my issues are specifically because of women in their 30s who drink oat milk, which is myself, my issues as an industry are specifically because of that particular group of people, you can go and unpack whether or not your assumption is correct, which is really valuable because then you can actually see whether or not Courtney is causing problems for your industry or whether or not she's actually super in favor of it, which is fabulous. The next really helpful feature of this dashboard is our comments table. So we asked a series of multiple choice questions, and then we asked some open-ended questions at the end. And that allowed us to pull all of those comments and aggregate them into a table here. We've got a summary of them with a word cloud, but often they talk about survey or farmers or rural. So you can have a look at those and see what happens in that word cloud. But I think for you, the most important thing is going to be this comments table. So you can search any word you want in this table, and then you can refine it by question type, location, age, or education. So let's say I wanted to search chemical. What I've got is all of the responses that featured the word chemical in our survey. And so this one here, the current agricultural system is delicate. Australia would benefit from better animal welfare and less chemical pesticides. This person is from Metro, they're 18 to 34, and they are reasonably well educated, and they answered sort of moderate, so 3. So these comments then start to colour what's actually going on behind those numbers and allow you to sort of get into the mind of the people that are either in huge agreements, huge disagreements, or sitting on the fence about your industry. So it's really worth going through them. You can also put your group in there, right? So buffalo. I was unaware that buffalo was a rural industry in Australia because I didn't know that any buffalo existed here. So often we're in our own head about whether or not people trust us. I think in a lot of the cases here, these industries were actually really surprising for a lot of the respondents for this survey. And so we got a lot of responses saying, thank you, I learned so much. I didn't know that these were specific industries that we could engage with. And so this survey in itself is also serving as a way to extend knowledge of your industries out to people that you wouldn't normally have connection with, which is really exciting and something to think about for future iterations of this survey. So you can find all of the times that a specific word is featured, and then you can download that data. So you might want to put that in a spreadsheet somewhere. You might want those quotes for something. You're certainly welcome to download them. Finally, something that might help people if they're like me and use an Excel spreadsheet, you can export any of this information to a table. So you can pick whatever question. It's sitting on chicken meat, so I'll leave it at this. So this question was regarding how aware you are of the chicken meat industry. So this is that self-rated knowledge piece, and it's scaled from not at all to slightly to moderately to very to extremely. You could pick a series of questions and have this particular spreadsheet fill out, and you can then break it down by the number of people who have responded to this particular question. So once you've done that, you've picked everything that you want in this survey. You could display the percentages if you're more of a percentage-oriented person, and you can do the same thing. So you can just download that and have it on your desktop to have a play around with Unpack, especially if you're someone like me that's not using internet a lot of the time because you're traveling. So that's the key information in this dashboard. I know we've had a couple of questions, so we might just pause for now and we can go through those. But if you do have a question you want to ask live, you're more than welcome to put your hand up as well. Perfect. So I might just address Jeremy. So Jeremy says, I think that you work across other ag industries. Which one has the highest self-reported knowledge score? Now, Jeremy, I wouldn't be able to tell you off the top of my head, but I will give you a very frustrating general answer and say that if it's on the supermarket shelves and consumers, and we're talking consumers, not community here, so the people that are making the purchasing decision, if consumers are regularly seeing it, it's more likely that the community has good knowledge of it. So think about your staple products, and we're talking raw products here. If you come to our webinar tomorrow, you'll see some of our seeds and grains, for example, community had no idea that they turned into a product that they consumed at the end of the day. But if you think about the raw products that the community consume, that the consumer buys, eggs, any type of meat that's not processed, any type of raw fruit or vegetable. These are the things that people are having interaction with every day. And generally, if you're having interaction with something and it's common, you're probably more likely to think you know more about it, which is a positive and a negative, depending on the way that you look at it, because it can create risk, especially if people have self-made assumptions about what happens, as we were talking about earlier, what happens in that supply chain system. Linda says, having been involved in horse and sheep traceability, there was a bit of resistance and lack of understanding from both the sector and broader communities. And yeah, I would totally agree with you, Linda. We do a lot of work, and I saw Karen was on the line with LiveCorp, and we've sort of tracked where people are aware of specific issues in live export systems. And it is pretty shocking to see, but they're also open to having the conversation. So it's just about really gearing that message towards, we want to hear from you. So we want to do that listening, and then we will respond appropriately based on what you've been saying. Okay, is there any other questions? Right. Well, I think that's all for now, unless you want to spend a bit of time diving into the dashboard and asking some questions with me. So I might show you one of those particular examples, and then I'll hand over back to the AgriFutures team because they have a survey. I'll push this now, but I'll probably push it again before I hand over to AgriFutures. This feedback from the Mentimeter that you will be given will really help us in making sure that our 2025 survey, so next year's survey, it meets all of your needs as an industry. So that's whether or not we're covering themes that you think are appropriate, whether or not you might need additional help in extension and adoption for this work, or whether or not you have any questions and you just want to engage with us to ensure that you know what's going on with this particular project. So I'd really, really encourage you to involve yourself in that survey, and we'll try and follow up as best as we can. So what I'm going to do now is just quickly give you an example of how you can answer a hypothesis. So let's go to that group needs slide again, and let's have a look at listening and responding, because we're specifically just talking about that in regards to traceability. Okay, so you might want to know something about whether or not different segments of the community are actually responsive to the work that you're putting in. So you might go, oh, we've got this extension team. We've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars sending them out into specific areas in the city, and they've been talking to them about honeybees. And we want to make sure that that is actually hitting the mark in terms of whether or not they see us listening to and responding to us. So you can go, okay, that's the question that we want to have a look at. Then you can just interrogate by the particular group that you're wanting to look at. So maybe you want to have a look at Metro, and we're just using a single item split for this one, just so we can understand it. Okay, has it changed anything? So if we've invested a lot here, it doesn't seem to have changed from the non-Metro group. Okay, interesting. Did it change based on our state? Maybe. What you can see here, the error bars are quite long. I would say that's because the sample size for those particular states is smaller, because we collect a nationally representative sample. So you can start to go, okay, our work seems to not be having particular impact across these groups. Or that might be what you think. But remember, this is a multi-year survey. So you might identify an area that you want to specifically focus on this year. Let's go age group. You might want to identify this particular age group as an area of risk for listening and responding. So this group particularly feels less heard than an older group. Next year, what you'll have is a second bar, and you'll be able to compare what's happened in 2024 with 2025. And that will directly talk to whether or not your input has made an impact. And that will help us measure over time the activities of each of our groups. So I'd encourage you to have a think about our drivers of trust. Again, that's in our Model Insights page. And how your industry could work together with other industries to help with procedural fairness, chemical issues, that responsibility piece, and regulation. And see if we cannot create a strategy that helps us measure that over time. What I'll do now is hand back over to the AgriFutures team. And again, please do the Mentimeter. It will help us so much next year. And I'll hang around for any questions while we do that. Thanks so much.
Wow, thank you, Courtney. We'll regroup. I might just pop my screen up with the QR code for that valuable survey that Courtney's given a great plug for. And once my Teams gets happening, and then we'll just have a little chat as we close out the webinar. So I will actually let you see the responses to that survey. So scroll through it and have a good go at some of those questions. A lot of them are easy answers, but some of them are much more open, so that you can give us the detail that you'd really like to. I think we'd all agree it was super interesting. Hard to comprehend just where we could go with it, but so much opportunity for each and all of our industries collectively. And just to answer the question, yes, you will get the recording. We have recorded this session and we'll send it out to attendees. So yeah, so survey away and complete that one so we know exactly what we can do for you in the future. But thanks so much, Courtney. You're always a pro, and this data set is always so great to dive into. But today, I can't believe quite how much I learned just in terms of what other people are thinking about our industries. So we talk to people all the time about our industries, but we don't get that level of insight. So it's just fabulous to hear. So thank you enormously for bringing this to us today. And we look forward to further opportunities in the future to dive in harder, because I know that you're a data nerd as well. So it'll be good fun all around for all of us. Thanks to the team who supported today. There's been a bit going on in the background technically. So thank you very much to Louise and Bonnie for that support, and to you guys for attending. I think we find it really valuable, but it's also great for us as an internal team to see your level of engagement and to understand how we can better provide a service that's valuable to you, and the details that are really going to support your industries particularly, and support our whole programs as we go forward. So that And the other point is that Louise has just popped the report for this particular piece of work for the first year of data into the chat for you. So you can click through to that. It's now on our website and publicly available, but that's a sneaky little quick link for you guys today for attending. So we'll pop that in the email with the recording as well for easy reference. But I'll just give one more point for people to ask questions if they'd like to before we all head off on our days. Think you're off the hook, Courtney. Everybody's busy doing their survey, which is fabulous. Yeah. So thanks again. Thanks, Courtney. Thanks again to everyone. You can keep doing that survey even once you jump offline from this webinar, and we look forward to engaging with you further in the future on this great data set and the results that come through in the preceding years. Thanks to you all.